Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this video I'd like to provide students with some help as they make their first reading through Aristotle's work on interpretation, which is the second part of the Organon, which is Aristotle's famous work on the art of reasoning. We're in chapter 5. As we begin this video, we've already studied the first chapter, which was an introduction to the study. The second chapter, we defined the noun. In the third chapter, we talked about the meaning of the verb within the study of classical reasoning. In chapter 4, we talked about enunciative speech or judgment or a proposition. And in this chapter here, we're going to continue our study of enunciative speech, which is really the focus of this work on interpretation. That's what the word interpretation actually refers to. And the goal of this study on interpretation is to understand the details of enunciative speech so that we can enter into the study of demonstrative reasoning in the analytics and have an understanding, a mastery, a scientific knowledge of propositions, which reasoning depends upon. So we're going to read through chapter 5 in this video, and I'm going to try to provide as much help as I can to make sure that students make a good beginning in this study. And as I always say, the only way to master the writings of Aristotle is to read through them again and again and again and allow Aristotle to interpret Aristotle. That's the key to mastering Aristotelian philosophy. There's no easy way to do it, and what I'm interested in doing as a teacher is not acting like a college professor and telling students what they need to know, telling them about Aristotle or telling them Aristotle said this and Aristotle said that, and sending these kids off with a few philosophy classes under their belt, imagining that they already understand philosophy. I think that's what's wrong with modern ideas of learning and philosophy. I'm encouraging students to study Aristotle. If they can't study it in the original languages, at least study it in a decent English translation and learn to read through the works of Aristotle cyclically, allowing every cycle through the works to provide commentary and exposition for all the content of Aristotle's writing. So let's read together chapter 5 here of Aristotle's work on interpretation. Aristotle begins and says, one first enunciative sentence, however, is affirmation, afterwards negation, but all the rest are won by conjunction. And you're going to need to read and reread that line a few times until you really get your mind wrapped around it. But the meaning is quite simple. The translation is questionable at best, but let me read it again. One first enunciative sentence is affirmation, afterwards negation, but all the rest are won by conjunction. What Aristotle is saying here is that there are a few different kinds of enunciative sentences. There are simple enunciative sentences, and there are composite enunciative sentences. He says one enunciative sentence is affirmation. And what I believe the translation is trying to express is first, one example of a simple enunciative sentence is affirmation, and afterwards, the other kind of simple enunciative speech is negation. So there are two kinds of simple enunciative speech. And then in the second sentence he says, but all the rest, that is composite, or different kinds of composite enunciative speech, all the rest are won by conjunction. Okay? So we're dividing the different kinds of enunciative speech that exist. And we're dividing them according to this principle of unity. An enunciative statement is either one or singular. I shouldn't say singular. That's not right. Enunciative speech is either simple or composite. Simple or composite. When he says one, what he means is simple. And then when he says they are one by conjunction, it means that they're composite. Okay? The first two sentences there. It is necessary, however, that every enunciative sentence should be from a verb or from the case of a verb. It is necessary that every enunciative sentence should be formed from a verb or from the case of a verb. And by case of a verb, he's referring to different tenses, different forms of a verb. All right? Every sentence should be from a verb or from the case of a verb. And we'll see some examples later in this chapter here that help to explain what he's talking about here. But every enunciative sentence must be drawn or produced from a verb or from the case of a verb. That is a present tense verb or a verb in another tense, either past or future. Because the definition of man, unless is or was or will be or something of this kind is added, is not yet an enunciative sentence. So when you read Aristotle, one thing you have to learn to do is read the sentence where he expresses some principle or concept, and then patiently continue, because he normally provides examples which help you to rightly interpret and understand the principle that he's explained. All right? So here he said, it is necessary that every enunciative sentence should be from a verb or from the case of a verb. And you may read that and say, what in the world does that mean? Well, keep reading. We have a continuation. Because the reason why every enunciative sentence must be from a verb or case of a verb, the reason why is because, take the definition of man. Unless is or was or will be, that is, unless a verb or different cases of the verb is, was, or will be, or something of this kind is added, it is not yet an enunciative sentence. So what does he mean here by definition of man? Well, he's going to show us what he means in the next sentence. That's why you have to patiently read, and then read Aristotle and allow Aristotle to explain Aristotle. Just keep reading. Keep listening to what he's teaching. Why, therefore, is the sentence, and notice it's in italics here in this translation, so we could put it in quotation marks to make it clearer. Why, therefore, is the sentence, quote, a terrestrial biped animal one thing and not many things? So let's understand this. Why is the sentence, quote, a terrestrial biped animal, unquote, one thing and not many things? First of all, notice that he refers to this little phrase, a terrestrial biped animal. He refers to it as a sentence in the translation here. That should be a sign to us that when he uses this word sentence in the translation, he's not talking about a complete sentence as we would think of it in English. In fact, this word sentence can be translated phrase or simply expression. Okay? So when you see the word sentence here, this is why you always have to study vocabulary in context. You always have to interpret words and their meanings based on the context where they're found. It's obvious that by sentence he does not mean a complete sentence, because a terrestrial biped animal is a sentence, according to the use of this word sentence. So this word sentence, at least in this sentence, and you see how this can be confusing, at least in this line, I'll say to make it clearer, simply means an expression or a phrase. Okay? A terrestrial biped animal. So we've got 4 words spoken. 4 spoken things. And yet, when we speak these 4 things are spoken together in one expression to signify one thing. And the one thing that they signify is man. So this is the example of what he just mentioned when he said, for the definition of man, the definition of man. Well, here is his definition of man. He continues to explain this concept and go into more detail with this example. For the definition of man, that is, a terrestrial biped animal, that phrase, a terrestrial biped animal, that is the definition of man. And notice definition, when he uses the word definition, he's not talking about a complete sentence. He's simply talking about the idea that is signified by the word man. That's what definition is. And I don't know this for certain. I'm just saying this off the top of my head, but I would assume that if you looked at the original language, the word for definition might be logos, which expresses this idea of the reason or the definition, which is the idea represented by a certain word. That's what a definition is. It's an explanation of the idea that's signified by a certain word. So when he says the definition of man, he's talking about that idea which is expressed with the word man. The definition of man, that idea, unless we join is or was or will be, a verb or a case of a verb, it is not yet an enunciative sentence. Why, therefore, is the sentence or expression a terrestrial biped animal one thing and not many things? How do we know? How do we know that? If a person's talking to us and they say all of these words in succession, they say a terrestrial biped animal, how does our mind know that though they have spoken 4 names or 4 words, how does our mind know to think of just one thing? How does our mind know that? Why is the expression a terrestrial biped animal composed of 4 words understood to be one thing, and not many things, not at least 3 different things? How does our mind know to take those words and keep them all together as a composite name for a single idea? How does our mind know to do that? Because it will not be one sentence because it is pronounced without intermission. It will not be one sentence because it is pronounced without intermission. And intermission here means that nothing is set in between the words. Nothing is set in to break up this succession of words. Okay, so it is pronounced without intermission. They're produced together. These 4 words are spoken. They're not separated, but that's not the reason why our mind understands it to be one idea. And then Aristotle says, to put an end to this discussion, he says, to speak of this, however, pertains to another discussion. Okay? So he introduces the problem here. How does our mind know when we listen to people speak? How does our mind know when to group words together and understand them as a single idea, and when to listen to them and interpret them all as separate ideas? How in the world does our mind know how to do that? He says that discussion is not appropriate in this place. That belongs someplace else. So that's a complicated discussion, and the location, when he says this belongs to another discussion, normally the place where those discussions are found is in the study of metaphysics. Okay? So one point that I want to make here as we continue studying Aristotle is, as we read through the works of Aristotle, there's a lot of stuff that Aristotle talks about that isn't important. And I say that with all respect before Aristotle, obviously. A lot of the things that Aristotle writes about, a lot of the things that Aristotle talks about are more or less irrelevant in our studies because living 2,400 years after Aristotle, living 800 years after St. Thomas Aquinas, we already know that we can trust Aristotle. When Aristotle was writing these things, however, in his generation, this was new stuff. Aristotle was the one revealing this science on interpretation to the world. The people that he was teaching didn't know these things, and some of the things that he taught contradicted things that beloved philosophers who lived before him had taught. And so when Aristotle taught ideas, he had to defend and prove everything that he said, because there were significant consequences in his teaching, in his philosophy. We'll find many places where Aristotle is going on and on and on to prove things that, to be honest, we don't need him to prove, because we already know that we can trust him as 21st century Catholics. Okay? So, as we read, this is an example of a place where Aristotle gets into this complex discussion and then says, don't worry about that. If you want to get into that, we'll talk about it in metaphysics. But we're not looking for the proof of this principle. We're simply looking for the principles because we're already assured by wise and holy men like Thomas Aquinas that we can trust Aristotle on these issues. Okay? So he tells us this question of how we know that a string of words is to be understood as a single idea. That's a complex question, and if you'd like to study that, you can do so in metaphysics. So let's keep going here. What he said that's significant at the beginning of the chapter is it is necessary that every enunciative sentence should be from a verb or from the case or tense of a verb. All right, so let's continue. One enunciative sentence is either that which signifies one thing or which is one by conjunction. One enunciative sentence is either that which signifies one thing, which we would call a simple enunciative sentence, or a sentence which is one by conjunction, a composite enunciative sentence. So we have this first division. So he comes back now at this point in the paragraph to what he said in the opening sentence. He comes back to it, all right? One enunciative sentence is either that which signifies one thing, a simple enunciative sentence, or which is one by conjunction, a composite enunciative sentence. Let's move on here. Many enunciative sentences are either those which signify many things and not one thing, or which are without conjunction. Many enunciative sentences are either those which signify many things and not one thing, or which are without conjunction. Now, if you read that and you say, what in the world does that mean? Just be patient and continue reading. Aristotle knows that if you read that sentence, you will not understand everything that it contains or expresses. He knows that. He's a teacher. He introduces the principle and then he goes on to explain it. So just keep reading. Many enunciative sentences are either those which signify many things and not one thing, or which are without conjunction. Let therefore a noun or a verb be a word alone. Let therefore a noun or a verb be a word alone. So what he says here is, we've talked about nouns, we've talked about verbs, now we're talking about enunciative speech. Let's not talk about nouns and verbs as speech anymore. Let's make it clear that they're simply words. They're simple expressions of simple, disconnected ideas. So let's get nouns and verbs out of the way and focus on enunciative speech. Since it cannot be said that he who thus renders anything manifest by articulate sounds enunciates, whether he is interrogated by anyone or not, but that he speaks from deliberate intention. So this sounds like a bunch of gobbledygook, I'm sure, but let's take it apart and patiently read and allow Aristotle to comment or explain Aristotle. It cannot be said that he who thus renders anything manifest. To render something manifest is to simply speak. It's to reveal the thoughts of one's mind. To render something manifest. To speak. We have an idea. The idea exists in our soul, and we render that idea manifest by speaking it. It cannot be said that he who thus renders anything manifest by articulate sound enunciates, whether he is interrogated by anyone or not, but that he speaks from deliberate intention. So if a man simply speaks a noun or a verb, we cannot say that such a man enunciates or speaks enunciatively, because he's simply stating a word, a disconnected idea, or a word that signifies a disconnected idea. That's not enunciation. And he says this strange thing: it doesn't matter whether he is interrogated by anyone or not. What does that mean? Well, if someone interrogates a person, asks questions, we can often answer the question with a single word. Okay, so for example, if somebody said to me, is Socrates a man? Is Socrates a man? I could answer the question and just say, he is. I can answer with a verb. Okay? If someone says to me, did it rain yesterday? I can simply answer and say, it did, or it rained. All right? I would be simply answering with a verb. And what Aristotle is saying is that's not enunciation, even though it is in a way, because the subject and the predicate are understood because of the question. All right? But when we express a response to a question with a single word, that word is not enunciation. He says, for enunciation to be produced, it has to be produced from a verb. And a noun and a verb alone are simply words. They're not enunciations. Even if a man is interrogated and responds with a single word, he does not enunciate. He speaks from, and this says, deliberate intention. He simply expresses an idea. Deliberate means a premeditated or thought of. Okay, and intention can be translated opinion. But of these, one is a simple enunciation, as, for example, something enunciated of something, or something enunciated from something. When he says something of something, he's speaking about affirmations, affirmative enunciation. Something is said to be true of something by joining the subject and the predicate together. Something is said of something. Something is said about a subject. Something is said to be true of a subject. Or something from something. That is, something, the predicate is what's the word that I should use, is disconnected or separated from the subject by denying that it's true of the subject. Okay, something of something, affirmation, or from something, which is negation. But another, he says, is composed from these as a certain sentence, which is now a composite. So a combination of simple enunciative statements can be joined together to form a composite enunciative sentence. And then we have here what's something that approaches the definition of a simple enunciation. He says, simple enunciation is sound significant about something being inherent or not being inherent according as times are divided. So the purpose of chapter 5, for all of that talk that he gets into, some of which he dismisses as being irrelevant, the point of chapter 5, the one thing that you need to walk away with when you read chapter 5 is this definition at the end of the chapter. The definition of simple enunciation. Simple enunciation is sound, that is articulate spoken sound, significant sound, about something, namely a predicate, being inherent, that is being affirmed of some subject, or not being inherent, that is being denied to some subject, according as times are divided, that is being joined to the subject by means of a verb or cases of a verb or tenses of a verb. So the purpose of chapter 5 is to introduce us to the definition of simple enunciation, which we're going to be studying in coming chapters. And then later in the book, we're going to get into composite enunciation. But that chapter simply contains an introduction, we should say, to enunciation in general, and then in the first sentence to the divisions of enunciation. One first enunciative sentence is affirmation, afterwards negation. Those are the two kinds of simple enunciation. All the rest are won by conjunction. Those are composite enunciations. He then gets into a discussion and says, but this is for a different study, this is for a different discussion, namely metaphysics. So you can simply ignore that as being a commentary that, as I said, Aristotle was obliged to explain some of his ideas because they were new and they contradicted some things that were already held and taught by other philosophers. Or he would simply have an audience listening to him assert these truths about these subjects, and the people would be asking, how do we know this to be true? So Aristotle sometimes takes time to give a proof for what he says, and other times, as we see here, he refers them to another of his works where they can find the demonstration of that idea. Okay? So he says this is irrelevant for now. So that just brings us back to the opening sentence. There are a few different kinds of enunciative sentences. He then picks up the topic again and says, one enunciative sentence is either that which signifies one thing or is won by conjunction, again talking about the divisions of enunciative speech. He then goes on to say, many are those which signify many things and not one thing, or which are without conjunction. And then he says, let therefore a noun or a verb be considered a word alone. Make sure you distinguish that if we speak a word, that's not enunciation. Even if we're just answering a question, that's still not enunciation. And then he goes on to say, but of these, one is a simple enunciation, as for instance, something of something, affirmation, or something from something, negation. But another is composed from these as a certain sentence, which is now a composite. So all of that to simply say, we've got this division of enunciative sentences into two kinds of simple enunciation and then composite enunciation. And in the last sentence, he defines simple enunciation and says, simple enunciation is significant sound. So what that means is spoken sound which is intended to signify an idea or a passion of the soul. Simple enunciation is a spoken sound intended to signify about something, a predicate, being inherent, being present in a subject, or not being present in a subject, according as times are divided, in either the present, past, or future tense. So the purpose of chapter 5 is to lead us to see the division of enunciation into a number of different kinds of enunciations, and then to get this definition of simple enunciation, which is going to be the topic that we investigate for the next few chapters. So I hope that's a helpful guide through this first reading of chapter 5 of Aristotle's On Interpretation. Again, this is intended for students in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy who are studying this book, studying it for mastery as we teach in the academy. It's not intended to be a standalone lesson. I really hope that no one is watching this video and then walking around talking about Aristotle says this, Aristotle says that, or just referring to things they hear in this video without studying Aristotle for themselves. That's one of the reasons people don't study Aristotle in the first place, is because it gets misrepresented by all this hearsay talk about philosophy. Study the writings of Aristotle. If you can't study them in the original Greek languages, study them here in English translation, or at least study them in a Latin translation. If you'd like some more help nailing down the vocabulary and you're fluent with Latin. But study chapter 5 now on your own and go back to the beginning. Reread chapter 1, reread chapters 2, 3, and 4, and reread chapter 5 again. And you'll start to see more and more that the doctrine of Aristotle becomes clearer and clearer as you continue to read and cyclically read the works of Aristotle and allow Aristotle to explain his own teaching. That's how it works. So I hope that's a helpful walk through your first reading. Now it's time for you to study the writings of Aristotle on your own for mastery. God bless your studies.